This month, we are marking 175 years of ministry at First Reformed Church in Grand Haven. Now, there are two mistakes that a church could make on such an occasion. The first mistake would be to dismiss the past, to ignore all of it. And we might call this the arrogance of modernity, which would be to assume that there would be no value in remembering any of our history, that there would be no lessons learned, no faithfulness of God to be praised. There would be nothing worth carrying forward, and all the people and all the ministry of the last 175 years has been inconsequential. Now, to do such a thing would go against what the Lord desires for his people. Many times in the Old Testament, the Lord commanded his people to remember his deeds, to remember his faithfulness. And so whether it was establishing a monument or celebrating a festival, God's people were told to remember. We do that every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper. We do this in remembrance of Jesus. We look back on God's faithfulness to help us today. So one mistake would be to dismiss the past. A second mistake you could make on an occasion like this is to live in the past, to worship the past, and we would call this the idolatry of traditionalism. And certainly there are many churches that have fallen to this temptation where they try to freeze time, and it's certainly a possibility for a church as old as ours. But when you do this, the church begins to function more as a historical society rather than a church, and it has characterized by a lack of vision rather than an ongoing, vibrant, and engaging ministry. I experienced this last summer when I was in England and studying all about John Bunyan. And I went to the church that John Bunyan started, the Bunyan Meeting. And what was interesting, the town of Bedford, it's very modern, just a very diverse group of people, immigrants from all over the world, very modern and all those kind of things. And when you go into that church, it's like you've stepped into a time capsule of like going back 200, 300 years. And they are so hung up on trying to hold on to what was, that the ministry they have today is, was not impressive or impactful at all. So we don't want to dismiss the past, and we don't want to live in it either. And so there's a third way, and I think this is a better approach, which is to look back to move forward. We want to look back to move forward. And so I think a helpful illustration for us might be to think about rowing. Think about being in a rowboat. You know, one of the things when you're rowing is you can't see where you're going. Your back is to, the direction you're headed. And so the only reliable way that you can row in a straight line is to keep an object behind you, like in your line of sight. You focus on something, and as long as the back of the boat lines up with that, you're going in a straight line. And even though it's unseen, you have confidence, like I'm moving where I want to go. I remember several years ago, we were up in the UP and we were on a pretty good sized lake and we had a rowboat, and I was on the far side and I had to get all the way back, and there was this large rock. It's really predominant, this really big rock. And I started rowing and I kind of looked at it and figured out, as long as I keep that big rock right behind the boat, I will make it to the cabin back. And I did. It was a long row, but I went a nice straight line and I kept rowing until I made it all the way back home. And you think about that imagery of rowing. That's what we're doing this month. We're going to be looking back so we have clear direction for the future. So we keep moving in the right direction. Now, as a church, Jesus is our rock. Literally and figuratively, Jesus is our rock. He is what we fix our eyes upon. And Hebrews 13:8, which is our text for today, is going to be helpful. It states this: Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. This verse tells us that while time marches on, while people change, while the world shifts, Jesus does not change. He is our constant. He's faithful in the past. He's present in the now. He's our hope for the future. So today, let's look at this verse in these three sections, past, present, future, and consider how this verse is so significant to us at this point in our history. So first, let us consider Christ yesterday. The writer of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday. Well, let's look back at yesterday. When we look back at the past 175 years of First Reformed Church, what do we see? Well, Grand Haven was a different town 175 years ago, as you can imagine. The population was about 600, and it was predominantly a lumber town. There were only two streets, what is now Harbor, that runs along the river, and Washington, the main street, which our church is on. The rest of the streets were just a bunch of cow paths. There was a dense forest just a block away from where the church is. If you're familiar, anything east of 4th Street was a dense forest. And the Grand River was loaded with steamboats going up and down for trade. Well, 175 years ago, a wave of Dutch immigrants started to hit West Michigan. They were looking to start a new life in America. And the Dutch settlers, when they arrived on the American shores, they didn't come empty-handed. They were poor, but they came with them this abiding faith in Christ. And so when they landed here, they ultimately landed here in Grand Haven, they had an idea about starting a church. They wanted to plant a flag here in this town of Grand Haven for Jesus. They wanted to be able to also worship in a language that they could understand. There was only one church in town, and they spoke English, and these Dutch immigrants did not. They also wanted a church for their children to be able to grow up in their faith and find their way in this new country. Now, they had no guarantees that this idea of starting a church was going to work. They couldn't see the future, but they did believe in the power of the gospel and that it was worth trying. And they trusted in the God whom they believed. So in 1849, they tried to put a church together. But there were some stubborn Dutch people. I don't know, that must... I've never known any stubborn Dutch people, but there were a few, and it didn't work. Well, they tried again. Good, the stubbornness was a good thing here. They tried again, and it worked. And they organized as a church in 1850. It started with 19 men and 11 women, 30 people. Now, these 30 people faced an immediate challenge, which was where to meet. Now, the families were all very poor. The entire congregation was just made up of common day laborers. None of them made over $18 a month. Now, that sounds like not much, and it wasn't, but it was even less when you consider they had to build their own homes here and feed their families and provide for all their needs. So there wasn't a lot of extra money to go around. But in true pioneer fashion, they decided that they were going to build a house of worship where they could serve their God. And as Grand Haven was built on the lumber industry at that time, there was often waste lumber that was floating down the Grand River after it had been sawed off at the mill, at the Ferry Mill, which is, if you're familiar with our area, where Verplanks is, all those piles of gravel. right on the Grand River next to the drawbridge. That's where the mill was. And so the men of the church went out in large canoes out on the Grand River, and they collected a bunch of this waste lumber. And they dragged the wood back in ox carts, and they erected a meeting house in 1851, though none of them had any building or construction experience. And the church was just one story, and it looked very much like a log cabin. It was 12 feet by 24 feet. And the dirt was the floor of the church. The seats were just made of the rough-hewn boards. The congregation had no pastor, but they held meetings every Sunday. One elder would read a sermon from some pastor that they had, got a transcript for it, and another would lead in the singing of the Psalms, and they had no instruments. Now, with God's blessing, in just a few months, it was necessary to enlarge that church building. The flood of Dutch immigrants landing in West Michigan was in full swing, and the church was eager to meet the needs of the newest residents. And in one of the most epic building campaigns in the history of Christendom, they added 12 feet to the back of the church. So instead of being 12 by 24, it became 12 by 36. And with the growing congregation around this time, the first pastor, Reverend St. Bulks, was called. And the congregation rapidly grew in size, and in just a few years, it exceeded 150 people. And First Reformed Church has continued to minister to the greater Grand Haven community ever since. Now, from its very humble origins, the story of this church, it's not the story of human achievement. It is the story of divine faithfulness. From that very first group of believers who had no money and met in the dirt floor cabin, through every season of trial and triumph, Jesus has been our rock. Through depressions and epidemics and 3 devastating fires, the Lord has been Jehovah Jireh. He has been the God who has provided and sustained for nearly 2 centuries every need. Through times of revival, He was the Lord of the harvest. There's a marvelous story in 1929. The church had brought in an evangelist and held a revival all during Holy Week. And then on Easter Sunday, 93 people came to faith in Jesus. Just think of that. Right before the Great Depression hit, 93 people gave their life to Jesus on a single day. And through the wars, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all those, the Lord has been the Prince of Peace for this congregation. During World War II, more than 100 people left the church to go serve our country in World War II. And if you've not been in our building, we have plaques in one of our entryways that remind us of those who went off to war and did not come home. But in all of that, Christ was our Prince of Peace. And through times of struggle, whether it was these church splits or devastating pastoral failures that marked the church for a season of time, the Lord has always been the Good Shepherd who has never, ever abandoned His flock. And so today, in this month, we don't gather to pat ourselves on the back for lasting 175 years. We can consider those first 30 men and women who started this church. And we can consider the thousands who have followed them since, who have sat in our pews, who have prayed, who have sang, who have witnessed, who have served here, and now they are all gone. The only constant from day one has been Jesus Christ. The only constant, our rock. And so as we celebrate 175 years of ministry, we can echo the words of Moses in Psalm 90, who says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. The Lord has been faithful to us yesterday, all throughout our history. And so looking back on this, all of God's faithfulness, that should fill us with gratitude, just thanksgiving. And that's again, we'd be so much worse off if we didn't do that, if we didn't have this gratitude for who God is. Gratitude for prayers answered, gratitude for souls saved, gratitude for children who've been ministered to, gratitude for lives transformed, gratitude for the hungry who have been fed, and so on. And we give gratitude for the faithfulness and the perseverance of those who came before us. And gratitude that we get to be part of this story. We get to be part of it. And whether you are Ginny Wester, who just recently celebrated her 98th birthday and has been a part of First Reformed Church since the day she was born, 98 years. So whether you're Ginny Wester or you're just the brand newest visitor, guest, attender, we're all part of this great story, and I'm so glad to have you along for the journey. And personally speaking, I'm so grateful to be part of the story of First Reformed Church. Looking through our records, we have had 23 senior pastors here, and I am the 23rd and the longest serving of all of them by about 5 years. And I consider myself, of the 23, the most blessed of all to have spent so much time here at this wonderful church home. And so as we look back and we see all of the faithfulness that Jesus has had towards our church, it gives us confidence to move forward today. This church has a grand story, yes, but this story is still being written. The pen is in God's hand, and we who are gathered here today, we are the ink on the page. So let's talk about Christ today. The writer of Hebrews also reminds us that Jesus Christ is the same today. He's the same today as he was yesterday. And so, as I mentioned before, today we celebrate the past, but we don't want to remain stuck there. Let's tell the stories. Let's display the old pictures. Let's celebrate with joy what God did back then, but let's not miss that Christ is still present now, and it's our time to be his people. Consider, I think a great illustration for this is the Milan Cathedral. They started building it in the year 1386, and it was not completed until 1965. And that whole time, it was pretty much under continuous construction. There weren't like big gaps. They were working on it for 579 years. Now, when construction began on the Milan Cathedral in 1386, the people who were laying those first stones knew they were never going to see it finished. And following them, generation after generation came and went, and they each added their part. Some were building walls, some were placing spires, some were doing sculptures, some were putting stained glass in the windows, until nearly 6 centuries later, in 1965, the cathedral was finally completed. Now, for almost 600 years of continuous construction, faithful workers gave themselves to something bigger than their own lifetime, trusting that what they began would one day, stand in glory. And when I think of the Milan Cathedral, I think of, that's a really good picture for ministry at First Reformed Church. Because it's not just about the building, it's about the ministry that we're doing here. And Jesus Christ is our foundation. And the generations that have come before us have built on the foundation of Christ with prayer and with sacrifice and with service and with witnessing and with generosity. All these things, they've been building continuously on this. But we would say, all those years in the Milan Cathedral, the work isn't finished here yet. No, today we're the workers. And fortunately, the master builder is here and he is directing the project. So what does this mean for us today? It means we are called to live with faithfulness. We are called to live today with faithfulness. We're not called to complete the entire work ourselves, but just simply to be faithful in the season that we're in. Our part matters, not because we're finishing it, but we are faithful to join in what God is doing across all the generations. So this is what this means for us today. We need to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in this generation. We need to love our neighbors in this community in tangible ways. We need to stand firm on the truth of his word in this cultural moment. And we need to be a conduit for the Spirit of Christ to move in this place. In other words, we need to fix our eyes on Jesus and keep rowing. This is not a time for us to drop anchor and take a break. There's a wonderful booklet was put out, or a book put out with our 100th anniversary, and just very comprehensive history. And I've loved reading through it over the years. And looking back, there's a special part I like to see. And it was when looking back upon the response of the congregation following a second devastating fire. It came shortly after the first. First Reformed Church pastor, Reverend Harmeling, said of his people at that time, "Faith's courage did not forsake us. Faith's courage did not forsake us." And I can only hope and pray that the same may be said of us, that faith's courage will not forsake us either, that we might do things today that will have such meaning and such impact that they will be remembered and celebrated when our church is at 275 years old, long after we're all gone. And those gathered at the 275th anniversary will marvel and say, was there ever a time when Christ worked in and through the church like he did in those days, in the 2020s and the 2030s? Was there ever a time when the Spirit was so undeniably present and the church was filled with so much joy? That is my hope, that we are just faithful in our day and faith's courage would not forsake us. May all that we do now inspire all those who come after us to follow after Jesus and to be bold and faithful for him in their day. Well, speaking of the future, let's speak about Christ forever. We had Christ yesterday, Christ today, and now Christ forever. And finally, Hebrews reminds us that Jesus Christ is the same forever. As we look into eternity, Jesus Christ is the same. And we need that assurance. 175 years ago, those first members, those 30 founding members, had no idea what the future would look like. In the same way, we have no idea what the future holds. The world is changing at the speed of light. I was born in 1973, and growing up in the late 70s and the 80s and even early 90s, that world is unrecognizable to the world we live in today. And no one can imagine where things are going to be in 50 years or 100 years from now. I mean, just thinking about technology and artificial intelligence, not to mention all the unforeseen cultural upheavals that are going to happen and the rise and fall of nations. And man, I mean, we can't even conceive of it. And I know for me, it can be a scary thing to look into the future with so much uncertainty and wonder what world my children and grandchildren are going to be navigating. But in the midst of all that, the one thing we do know is that Jesus will be the same then as he is now. And that his kingdom, the kingdom that he's building now, will not fail. It will not fail. So as we look at the big picture of what God is doing through all eternity, we realize that the story of this church is, and what we're doing today, it's just a small chapter in the great story of God's kingdom. And you must know, I hope you know, but you must know that our purpose is not just to keep this institution of First Reformed Church alive, just to keep it going, to keep the doors open. Our purpose is to prepare for a coming kingdom that has no end. And one day the mission of the church, First Reformed Church, and the global church, one day our mission will be complete. The trumpet will sound, Christ will return, and every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's why we move forward with hope. We move forward with hope. The best days of this church, the truest glory of this church, it is not behind us, and it's not even in front of us on earth, but it's in eternity with Christ when he returns and he makes all things new, and the church will be triumphant in every conceivable way as we glory in the presence of Christ and his kingdom. And so today, we don't just celebrate a long history. We go forward, just like in that rowboat, with our backs to the future, because we can be sure that the one who has led us this far will be faithful to bring us all the way home to that distant shore. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And in the end, that is the story of First Reformed Church.